Hello, good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Miguel Amado. I'm director here at Sirius Art Center, and I am delighted that we have a closing event of Marie Brett's exhibition with our guest, Chris, who will be delivering a talk, and then we'll be engaging in a conversation with Marie. This closing event will continue our work of providing critical context and producing knowledge about Marie's work, Marie Brett's work, which we have been exhibiting here at Sirius since April this year in different forms and iterations. This exhibition was a conversation that developed across a couple of years and included a new work which we commissioned with the support of the Arts Council, and also a presentation of the various films that Marie has produced in recent years, plus the room where we are, which is a mixed archival artwork display that somehow attempts to provide an overview of recent practice. Marie's work is usually produced in collaboration with communities of interest and other creative practitioners. So it was quite an interesting challenge for us to have an exhibition here, because our starting point was how to translate into a gallery context the practice that usually is produced for off-site contexts and sites. And on the other hand, Marie's work touched upon too many themes that are relevant to us, from questions that relate to Irish identity and culture to more broader societal questions that have to do with the human condition. And we have been producing a series of events across the summer and the spring that have created a platform for discourse for Marie's practice, and it's great that we have the opportunity of having Chris, who came from London, to work with us today. Chris is an art writer and critic from Ireland, currently operating from London. His writing has appeared in different art magazines, including Frieze and Art Monthly. And he is quite interested in different themes related to the Irish art context, but also Irish society in general. And what he's doing today is putting some of his thoughts related to pre-Christian culture and values and ideas in context within the Irish art practice, and then specifically focusing on Marie's practice through a Q&A. I will then join the Q&A, and then we will also open up to everyone. So again, thank you so much for joining us today, and I hope you will be joining the conversation as much as I know I will. Thank you. So I welcome now Chris, and we'll continue.
Great. I've got my text here. Great. Can everybody hear me okay? Great. But yeah, no, I'd just like to thank Miguel for Miguel and Marie for the invitation. When I was kind of invited when I was invited to take part, I was quite excited to like kind of think about what approach to take, and I think I think in like developing the text, I began with a kind of simple or like a modest observation that like this kind of recurring return to the place of folklore within Irish art is kind of full of different histories and motivations. So the text today is just to try and kind of think that through and to begin a discussion around that. I'm just going to take some more. Great. I don't know what you think about. I don't know what you think about. Sorry. I don't know what you think about fairy forts, and when asked, I like to maintain an ambiguity around my own thoughts. Deep down, I know that I hold no belief and never have. Mostly, I've carried a weighty embarrassment around the fact of folklore in Irish life, and the literature surrounding it leans towards a similar sentiment. One of the more recent examples caused an international storm of denunciation and self-castigation. Danny Healy-Rae, a thickly accented politician from rural Kerry, the Irish Times reported in 2017, quote, claims ferry forts caused dip in Kerry roads. Quote, there are numerous ferry forts in the area, he said at the time. I know that they are linked. Anyone that tampered with them back over the years paid a high price and had bad luck. Paid a high price and had bad luck. I'm not sure if he's accusing the construction company exactly, even if we take the facts for granted. But presumably the bad luck would follow them into their personal lives, so the connection to the road is not exactly clear. We can only speculate, as his statement is loaded with ambiguities and vague correlations. Yet, his official complaint to the council simply asks if the ferries were responsible, which makes the original news report seemingly inaccurate, as they stated he had asserted it as a fact. The council attempted to reassure him, and us presumably, with the banality of technical details. It was, quote, a deeper underlying subsoil geotechnical problem. International media picked up the story and revelled in its tongue-in-cheek clickbait potential. The Healy-Rae family are larger than life, as is the mythology around the ferries. But previous infrastructure projects, such as a 1990 plan for a road in County Clare, had actually been rerouted to navigate around the precious ferry forts. The New York Times reported on the story then, running a headline, quote, if you believe in ferries, don't bulldoze their lair. The warnings by a local were stark, quote, if they bulldoze the bush to make way for a planned highway bypass, the ferries will come, to curse the road and all who use it, to make brakes fail and cars crash, to wreak the kind of mischief ferries are famous for when they are angry, which is often. There's a lot of poetry in his warning. Note how the first clause, quote, to curse the road and all who use it, perfectly balances with the second, to make brakes fail and cars crash. How the curse slips between the road and its users. How the syllables of brakes fail slide so effortlessly into the alliteration of cars crash. The response he received is nonchalant, but not exactly dismissive. Quote, the engineer in charge of the bypass around the County Clare town of New Market on Fergus says he will think it over. Academics at University College in Dublin were quoted for the story too and attempted a form of damage control, putting their full institutional weight behind the person who the New York Times described as the local. Eddie Linehan is a renowned folklore expert in his own right. They explained. He had conducted extensive independent research on oral storytelling about fairies and was a regular speaker at festivals on the topic. I don't think it's an accident that stories about ferry forts flare up around the construction of motorways. Motorways occupy an oddly charged position within the story of modern Ireland. Membership of the EU sees investment flow into infrastructure projects, and motorways are especially held up as a symbol of a new economic vitality. Also through EU membership, Ireland becomes an attractive doorway for American corporations who are interested in our unfettered access to European markets. But much more changed than we're often willing to admit. In 1999, infrastructure would have been built around the ferry forts out of respect. In 2017, we didn't choose to change this policy. It just stopped seeming possible to do anything else. Conversations around Irishness tend to hold an ambiguous relationship with language and geography. The terrain we are describing typically points elsewhere, to waves of immigration across the UK, from Glasgow to Liverpool and London, and further away towards New York. When the Irish did arrive in these places, accusations that they might be disloyal or untrustworthy pointed to Rome. The ferry forts are what was left behind and forgotten as people left, and what got in the way for those who stayed and tried to construct a new future for themselves. The Irish are not only found elsewhere, but Ireland itself is oriented around other places. Not too long after 1999, Mary Harney, a politician committed to a low-tax model of governance, infamously told a business group that we were, quote, spiritually closer to Boston than Berlin. In more recent memory, turns of phrase continue this tradition. Contemporary efforts to market and sell the Irish brand abroad have coined the phrase the wild Atlantic way, both a factual marker of our proximity to the Atlantic Ocean and a metaphorical pun on the charm of an undeveloped natural landscape. To attract the gaze of tourists, Ireland takes on its own cliches, rewriting the story it tells about itself through the generic vocabulary of contemporary tourism. The untouched rural sublime, the authenticity of heritage crafts, the warm welcome of docile people, and in turn, welcoming the flow of international capital. The country holds up its symbols of corporate life with pride. Gleaming conferences, a homegrown culture of Silicon Valley-styled tech startups, EU-funded motorways. Mostly, I encounter stories about fairies, forts, and myths from a pre-Christian Ireland in the work of a contemporary generation of Irish artists. Here, art functions as a special kind of refuge for forgotten or lost ideas. Such ideas are nurtured with careful attention paid to the texture of its nostalgia and the quiet endurance of the stories which structured the lives of people almost like us. The return, then, to a pre-Christian culture also acts as a form of conceptual sabotage, particularly when put in conversation with everything that would follow: the rule of the British Empire and its consequences for the Irish language, the stranglehold of contemporary capitalism on our political horizons, and its consequences for housing, health, and inequality. We can see how the realities of empire and fairy forts sets out a vocabulary of power and resistance, drawing parallels between questions of Irish identity and a global struggle for self-determination, connecting Irish artists with wider conversations around identity, how language is shaped by power, gaps in historical memory, place, and critique. This is a thrilling proposition, especially now as these discussions gain unprecedented visibility within the art world. I am reminded of an older debate about the relevance of the Irish art scene to wider art world concerns. In 1989, Circa Art magazine dedicated a special issue to the then recent critical debates around postmodernism, and a text by John Hutchinson interrogated the possibility of a postmodern Irish art scene itself. He argued, quote, "Irish culture isn't markedly post-industrial, at least in comparison with the USA or Western European nations. And there was, quote, certainly not a modernist avant-garde worthy of the name. Therefore, the economic trajectory that kicked postmodernism into life did not take place here. So we could not expect the same ideas to develop in the same way. Where exceptions may be found, he continued, such as in the work of Willie O'Doherty, Dorothy Cross, and Vivian Dick, the national specificity of their work could contribute to these debates around postmodernism, but was also quite independent of it, responding to dynamics located closer to home. A feminist critique of Irish statehood, a mistrust of photographic representations during the Troubles, and an oblique stance in the favour of political turmoil and unresolved cultural traumas. I am pointing back to Hutchinson's confrontation between the Irish situation and its relationship with current developments in the art world to find a vocabulary for the present moment. Part of the conversation is invariably about how the Irish art scene might place itself within an art world discourse, but also why we are compelled to do so and on what terms. Conversations around post-colonial culture are typically marked by a deeply felt sense of inferiority, as a local scene will invariably not follow the script of a discourse unfolding elsewhere. In 1950, Australian critic Arthur Phillips coined the cultural cringe, a term to describe how domestic culture is often assumed inferior to work produced in major centres, typically London and New York. Continuing a similar theme in 1968, radical Brazilian educator Paulo Freire argued in Pedagogy of the Oppressed that, quote, the social I of the invaded person will, like every social I, is informed in the socio-cultural relations of the social structure, and therefore reflects the duality of the invaded culture. It is sometimes said that the Irish were the first to decolonize in the 20th century, although recent work by artists and others might prompt us to ask how thorough such decolonization actually was. In 2016, Koyo Ko, the then curator of EVA International, described how, for the British Empire, Ireland acted as, quote, the primary testing territory of Western colonization systems before their expansion to the global map. Koyo also noted the marked absence of post-colonial discourse within Ireland, a remarkable fact considering, quote, the palpable consequences, particularly for the Irish language. Yet, post-colonialism is not just tied to notions of empire, but is underscored by racialized exploitation. Certainly, the Irish continued to face prejudice and discrimination after independence, but as immigrants who assimilated in the US and UK, they too became complicit in dynamics of racial injustice inside and outside the global north, particularly within the police. Recognizing the darker threads through Irish identity seems to me to be an essential and ethical first step. Part of our attraction to myth and folklore is the space it makes for alternative ways of thinking, harboring a dissident spirit and taking an oppositional stance against the contemporary situation. A critically engaged return to folklore negates received expectations, inscribed ways of life, the shadow of the status quo. The attraction to folklore is not an escape, but a reorientation to the everyday and the familiar. Core to any folkloric tradition is the parable as a narrative device. Parables exist to share knowledge and warn of danger, to impart meanings and values across generations. Such traditions tend to be maintained by the poor and the downtrodden, and therefore stand in proximity to a wider sense of public, of citizenship, of the demos. We can immediately recognize how this foregrounds the role of the artist as a storyteller, but I think the implications are more holistic, in encompassing not just content of the artwork, but its production and dissemination too. Such stories change and evolve each time they are returned to, and therefore set out a shifting set of relations between those who are involved. Parables arrive to us from the past, stubbornly surviving everything which is erased through time. They may embody things we wish to forget or desperately hold on to. To the extent that we recognize their ideological function, they necessarily become central to any critical project. I began by exploring the relationship between folklore, post-colonial identity, and the politics of land, and I will conclude on this material and conceptual register. Great, so that's, thank you. So I'd like to thank you all for patiently listening to the talk. So we're going to move to this sort of second phase now. So me and Marie are going to have an in conversation and discuss some of the ideas of the show and some of the ideas that I outlined in the text. So I'd invite Marie up now. I'm going to move over. Great. Okay, get some more water. Great, yeah. Great. Oh, yeah, great. But yeah, so I'm going to put it out to the crowd as well that we're going to have our in-conversation, and then Miguel is going to join us, but we'll be taking questions from the crowd as well. So if there's anything that's stirring in the back of your heads, that I'm very welcome. But I'd like to begin, I suppose, with the latest commission, so Ritual of Stone and Water. I got to spend some time with it today, and I think I've got to say, like, it's a really kind of extraordinary piece, and I think there is something about the kind of the like specificities about the space, how the objects in the space, and how it kind of guides your way through. And I was particularly interested in how you're kind of evoking a kind of language that we're familiar with kind of like a language we're familiar with, like in terms of sculpture, but then also this language of I think it's referred to as the agricultural vernacular, and then also this kind of spatial language of like the whole of like holy sites, and I think that's a really layered piece, considering the way we think about these ideas being kind of overlapped together, right? Like Irish identity, the kind of rural landscape, and these kind of folklore traditions, and then this kind of manifesting in this kind of physical and artistic way. So I'd like to just begin by kind of getting some of your initial thoughts about the commission and how you were thinking about kind of navigating those sort of different visual languages.
Sure. I suppose it's like you say, it's a recent work, so it was born of a time that I felt that collectively and globally we've been through this massive social trauma. So I'd been thinking during that time, when I knew the commission was there, how we as people cope in a sense of anchoring in some way our kind of psychic humanity, but in a very much a pared back individual way. So separate from the state, separate from institutions, how individuals look to hope and cope. So I was thinking about this generally, and I think the commission offered an opportunity to drill in a bit more on that and to look at what opportunity is there in what I kind of call like an ancestral trace, in terms of not saying things have been lost or have shifted, but that's just ancestrally there as a digit memory of ways that we as people can seek stabilisation, let's call it in some way. So I was looking at, like your talk unpacked in many different ways, folkloric acts. So I suppose considering what folkloric acts are present, what's present but hidden, because I'm really interested in things that are hidden or under rocks that you very rarely get to see under, and how might that be relevant now to the times we're in.
Yeah.
And the sense of the land and the I suppose that ancestral trace in the land seemed really present to me over that period of time. And I think I feel people's churches had dissolved. So whether the church is mass or whether it's the pub or whether it's shopping or whether it's going out with your mates, whatever your church is, that had dissolved. So people were internalising and thinking reflectively about their own strategies for stabilising themselves again. And I thought, well, what about making a work about this? It felt really timely. So I suppose the next step then, in effect, the way that I work, because I've got this social arts practice, is to, once that question has been reached, it isn't crystallised, but it's a loose sketch of a question. I then gather people in terms of asking them, are you interested in contributing into this and thinking about this with me in some way? So there's what Miguel said there earlier on, a kind of a community of interest orbits around the work in different ways. So some people dip in and out, some people are kind of embedded in. And we began to explore this sense of an Irish vernacular structure embedded in the landscape that I kind of feel is almost like a precious storehouse of the silo. Felt very important to work with that symbolism of the storehouse of the silo, and the sense of it almost being, what's the word when you have your treasures in the church that your bones of the saints are in. I can't think of the word. Thank you. So it's like a reliquary. I was almost thinking of it that way. But also the sense of the folkloric act of how you approach a site of significance. So I wouldn't necessarily say a holy site. I know a lot of people may or may not use that language, but a site of significance, how you might approach it and what you might be seeking. So looking at I suppose, and I can talk separately, in terms of the kind of the acts of folklore and ritual and rite and tradition related to people's personal lived experience. And then people started inputting from various different aspects. So, in terms of chiromancy and storytelling, through to kind of farming and agriculture, through to the kind of supernatural investigators, through to scholars and folkloric experts. So a whole range of thinking would spiral around a work, and then it gets anchored in its materiality. So does that give you a sense of the trajectory, I suppose?
Yes. Yeah, no, I think there's so much to that installation, because I definitely want to speak to you about the socially engaged aspect of that work, and I think there's something about that trajectory within your practice that is really, really kind of intriguing there. And then I also want to talk to you a bit about that kind of spirituality. And I know that there's some Yeats texts on fairies and the occult that are kind of quoted as well. But the one thing that I maybe wanted to begin with as well was, because one of the really interesting things to me about any conversation about identity or these kinds of legacies that come to us from the past is that you don't choose them, right? That and that's where a lot of the ethics and the kind of politics of this comes from. And we can see in certain contexts, I think it's very pronounced in the UK, where these kind of claims to be sort of true British or real British take on a very dark and kind of dangerous kind of context. And there's that in Ireland too, but I think what your project is kind of engaging in, and I think what kind of most Irish artists kind of engaging with folklore, there is, I think, like you said, this kind of question that's being posed, right? And that with with folklore kind of brings to mind then this idea of like the people who are continuing the stories, and so there's a set of relations there, and then there's these relationship with the landscape and the kind of economies of rural communities, and there is something that you're kind of assembling this material and you're assembling people, and in the gallery kind of prompts a question and it becomes this discussion point, but then within the space there is this kind of troubling of it as well, right? Because the exterior has this more kind of material and curious layout, and it kind of leads you around. But then when you're inside, it kind of has this totally different space. So I'd be curious to hear a little bit about maybe that journey and that kind of playing with the interior and the exterior. And it seems to relate, I think, a bit to this idea of having a question and offering it as a prompt and kind of facilitating discussion around it.
I think you're spot on. I suppose I feel you have to walk the walk, and if it's too comfortable, then maybe you're not stepping beyond what's known in your world. So for me, it's really important that there's a challenge of knowability or ease, and I think that relates back to my understanding for me of folkloric acts. So this sense of it's not charming and comfortable and easy for me. I can only talk from my own experience, but my earliest understanding of those acts to do with death ritual, to do with family tradition, they're uncomfortable and they're unknown and they're magical and they're powerful. And so the sense of potential in terms of what can happen is phenomenal, but there's an inherent sense of danger there because the very act of asking for protection or asking for guidance or asking for cure is inherent with this pivot of there's a problem, there's an urgency, there's a necessity for cure. So it's a gift, and it's something that has to be sought with intention and a clarity of intent, but it's not an easy walk to take, I don't believe. And I think if you're talking about transformation, which a lot of folklore can or may enter into that sphere, which I don't talk directly about, but in that we're in a conversation in terms of what the ritual of stone and water piece can do. If it's working, it would take on being a transformative space for the person that elects to be in that space. But it doesn't come without a price, I suppose, is what I feel is important. So yeah, the bright orange was really important. But is it a warning, is it a distress, or is it an aid in terms of the symbolism of that colour? And stepping in to the gallery very intentionally with the structure backing onto you. You have to be brave and be curious and go into the unknown and circle in then and find that you can enter, and then you have that whole question of should I enter onto what's potentially hallowed ground, and playing with the symbolism of that. So I suppose that was very purposeful, and I think within the gallery, the construct of the gallery to play with that, I suppose, in terms of blocking that beautiful view out to the water. And I think the work offers potential in different spaces to go further with that in terms of what you have to do to reach it and to enter into it, what the trade is in a way, as opposed to it just being easy liberty.
Yeah, because I think that's maybe one of the defining differences between like a more kind of open and like kind of progressively minded kind of conversation around like identity and legacy is that you're not taking it for granted. No. That like these things don't arrive to us in easy, neat packages, and that's often the way that like a more reactionary kind of discourse around it is that we assume that these identities are these stable, concrete things, and that couldn't be further from the truth. And there is something about kind of making peace with history and stories that arrived to you from the past that I think is this really kind of really fascinating, curious space. But yeah, but I think in terms of that socially engaged aspect as well, I think in some of in your body of work, I think that the role that the people you collaborate with, the groups that you're connected with, often takes a more explicit role, and I'm very curious to talk about that, especially with the Yes, But Do You Care piece. But I was curious to ask, do you sense that there's maybe a shift with this more recent one? Because you wouldn't know initially that process had kind of taken kind of behind the scenes.
Yeah.
But I think in terms, even in just our discussion now, there is a level of like respect that you have with these kind of sites, these like kind of sites of ritual, and I think that may be reflective of that like socially engaged shift.
Yeah, I think that's perceptive of you. I think in the sense of, so using the Yes But Do You Care as an example, because it's here and there's people here that were involved in the creation of that work as well. I think that work and other work, so like the work here that's the Day Crossing Farm, that would be with people that have been trafficked and held as modern day slaves. The work is immensely charged and takes a lot to hold the work. So it takes a lot to make and stay brave in the work, and it takes a lot to then not claim one particular reading from the work afterwards.
Yeah.
So to hold the work open and allow multiple readings in takes quite a lot of stamina to do that, from my perspective. And at the time of being, getting the commission and the liberty of that, I felt maybe it's a good opportunity, and I only realised this retrospectively, maybe it's a good opportunity to create a work that's not got such direct personal trauma embedded in it, in terms of working with people who are holding that, and I'm embedding that knowingly in a work. But maybe it needs to be a broader collective trauma in terms of the coronavirus and what we've all experienced, which is lived, so it's not unpacked, and it's not, people aren't being explicit about it yet. Maybe that open terrain has to be something that I step into in a broader way, as opposed to a singular story.
And I'd kind of touched on some of this in the talk, but I was definitely had you in mind when I was thinking about this, the way that deploying these kind of, like deploying certain kind of narratives in a public sphere takes on this kind of democratic function, that like you're kind of assembling stories and you're presenting them in a public sphere, not necessarily to make a statement or to share your experience, but it's to kind of arrange that situation, and that goes right back to the heart of like a discourse around socially engaged work. But it's quite like kind of materially led, and then like materially led with the ritual piece, and then quite like there's like a kind of performance, and there's conversation about cinema that's taking place in the care piece.
I think what I'm looking to do in terms of thinking about that sense of democracy is, I suppose, I'm looking to try and locate something that isn't visible.
Yeah.
So maybe the work, maybe the social practice is a bit more niche in that sense of it's not working within a territory that's known and championing that territory. So whether that's that experience or that demand or that advocacy, it's working with people to find a way to express this territory that's either evolving. So using the Yes But Do You Care as an example, because it's make it physical and easy to understand what I'm reaching for. That experience of people caring for somebody else that they love, the hardship of that, and the impact of new legislation on that evolving, ongoing relationship is uncharted and unspoken about, and could be potentially very challenging to locate and then share. So but it's not knowing at the onset what it is.
Yeah.
So the very essence of working with people for me is entering this space of unknown, which is a bit like entering into that gallery and finding, will it just be this circular silent that I'll walk around, or will there be something beyond that? So the unknown is fundamentally important for me when I work with people. If I knew the answers, I wouldn't work with people. Why would I work with people if I knew what the outcome and answers were going to be? I'm actively trying to engage in this reciprocity of them affecting and influencing and inspiring me. So I think this sense of, I suppose, rights and wherefores control power within the work shifts continuously in any sense of my social practice. And I suppose it's to do with people are inevitably going to have different priorities as to why they've entered that space, but it's evolving. And I think I talk about this pivot of risk and trust, because it's like quicksand in terms of we're both, in terms of the community and myself, are entering in unknown territory, exploring something that's can be quite humanely challenging to consider and think about, and then working out what's appropriate to put into the public sphere and why and how. So I suppose rather than knowing where the red flag is at the onset and then moving in and making a piece about it, I don't tend to work like that at all.
Yeah. Because I think in terms of what you were saying about this kind of conversation about democracy, the public sphere, and those things that are kind of both unseen, but then groups who are overlooked or not listened to as well. I was interested in, because even though I think in like formal terms, there's maybe a difference between ritual and care. But there's definitely this recurring motif of like doubling, that like particularly with ritual, there's the exterior, and you enter the interior, and then in the video piece, Yes, Do You Care, there's this kind of recurring image of like the same performer being kind of layered upon, or this kind of split screen motif as well, and this kind of reference to individual experience, kind of mental health. And I was curious if you could expand upon that a bit more about this kind of process of like revealing things and how that kind of manifests in the work.
I suppose there's always a public-private.
Yeah. Always,
and it's to try and embed that in the work. So within the practice, there's layers and layers of the public-private. So the intimacy is revealed, and that private, intimate world that you can create, and then at what point aspects of that manifest in a public sphere, and why and how. So, and I suppose there's layers. There's like in any social arts practice, there's like 6 layers. So there's there's the question, and then the invitation, who is it and why, and then there's doing something together, whatever that is, and then there's making something, and then there's that, and all that's private, all that's hidden, and even though people know that I'm an artist, my intention is to make artwork that will go into the public sphere. There's this balance between what's appropriate and what isn't to then take out into the public sphere, and then who talks about it and why and how, in terms of its legacy as well. So
there's something about the invitation as like, because I remember in a previous talk you were talking about being very interested in kind of why someone would want to work with you, and making sure that like they can feel like kind of an ownership or like a kind of deep sense of involvement in the space, or sorry, in the project. But then the sculpture ritual does sort of, again, in like a very different way, work again on that kind of model of like an invitation. And I think it's hard because you're inviting into something you don't know what it is. So it's more back to this thing of you trust and you walk the walk, and you trust on your, what I call a kind of ancestral register. So some people would call that instinct, this sense of reaching for something you might not be able to articulate what it is, but it seems like the right time and place to make this step with this artist, or for me to make this step with this community or individual. But to get all that back into the work, so that the public then step into that zone of where do I sit in this work. So it's not passive. I'm not interested in making passive work. Like I want it to be really immersive. I want it to be really affecting. I really want it to be that people, not are troubled in a bad way, but are troubled in a really positive way. So and that goes back to my kind of whole connections of early, young developmental years as a kid. This whole folkloric act of, like my dad's family talking about, death ritual, and me witnessing it and it being positively troubling. So it's to make that sit in the work
So the work has a life beyond the people who make and made it, and it goes out and potentially has impact ricocheting further on beyond what we own and hold. But that's hard to explain at the onset to ourselves in the making of it. So it's to see, well, what's if you step into it, what's the potential for it? But it can't be passive, or I suppose it can't be. It needs to touch you. You need to physically be affected by it to allow that.
There's a really fascinating kind of shared vocabulary here between passivity and a sense of agency and impact and things affecting you on like an affective register, which ties in to the kind of this kind of question of like magic and the occult. And I was very interested in the references to Yeats there, because he has this strange relationship with like an Irish or an Anglo tradition, and his writing about folklore and magic and the occult in Ireland is kind of personally of interest to him, because he's exploring these kind of esoteric ideas, but then he's also kind of positioning himself within a kind of conversation within Ireland, kind of amongst different groups. And I was curious in terms of your research or your thinking, in terms of Yeats, or in terms of this kind of sense of like magical thinking and the occult. How is that interesting for you, or what's your perspective on some of that?
I think there's two layers there. So if you think of like Yeats, I didn't pursue it, but it's present in the thinking of this. It brings up aspects of privilege and control and rights and power in terms of where Yeats can locate himself and his thinking and the work, which would be very different to my narrative of on the ground, experiential family trace. So they're very different things.
Because like one of his books on folklore, kind of famously, right? He's like interviewing like rural peasants, and he's in this kind of ethnographic mode of like research, treating kind of the Irish poor almost as this like different group that he's studying, and that's that speaks like power and privilege, and also it kind of is often the case that these oral storytelling traditions are maintained by people who are poor or kind of on the margin, and very kind of quickly dismissed by people who are in power. And
wouldn't necessarily articulate it either, would more live it as opposed to talk about it. So this sense of who talks about it or writes about it and why and what the intention is, and the problem potentially of locating yourself as someone at best curious. I think that's all very messy from my point of view, which is a whole anthropological kind of discussion, there's a whole world of kind of discussion there. I suppose, but that's not to dismiss the writings themselves, but the contextualisation is problematic for me. I think I've found it very interesting over the last couple of years. There was online discourses around his work where the context gave liberty to some actually really interesting writing. So because it was articulated as scholarly, and I suppose that gave permission for it being quite dangerous and scary in many ways. Whereas if it had been located as, this is my experience and these are my beliefs as a consequence of it, I think less people within I was like on a global forum, would have engaged with it. I think it was interesting who was engaging with it, because it was seen as a more abstract scholarly text. And I found that amusing, but interesting as well. As opposed to the more traditional kind of folkloric collections, which, as you say, the kind of 1930s and onwards in Ireland, which are field resources, let's call them field resources, which are problematic as well, do you know, in the sense of how, I think I won't go down that road, but I have opinions and thinking a lot about how folkloric collections are held. I think in terms of, from my perspective, I'm looking more at activating the residual memory or the associated thinking, as opposed to tying it too closely to either archival kind of references, which are all there and they're plentiful and there's loads and loads and loads of them. And I'd have worked with Dr. Jenny Butler, who's got many of the texts here in terms of as a student. So in terms of actually thinking and locating myself as a learner within the sphere of, I suppose, myth, magic and folklore in a very broad sense. But they're pockets of potential, whereas I'm looking to take threads of those very lightly into the now, the here and now. So it's not a kind of romantic notion of looking back to the past or keeping some tradition alive. I'm not pursuing that at all. It's more what actual relevance does it have for us now, here, today. So I think Yates can be useful.
Yeah.
It can allow an entry for people who would otherwise potentially be dismissive of where folklore is located. But I think they could do with being a middle ground, I think.
He's just such a strange character, and it's so kind of exciting to me, or kind of fascinating that he's there at those very early moments of the formation of the Free State, and but he's also in which becomes a very kind of Catholic-led project, but he's kind of engaging in all of these very esoteric ideas around the occult, which is a whole other tradition. And it's like there was efforts to write that out, but it's kind of very much there. Yeah, but like you're saying, I think there's a lot of stuff around this. I wanted to speak. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit more in detail about the yes, but do you care installation as well. Okay. And I think that there's I think that I think that this kind of question of care is like a really fraught subject within the history of Ireland, and I was interested in that Lunacy Act is from 1853, right? So this is a moment that precedes the creation of the Irish state, but then with kind of recent updates to the legislation and kind of very important campaigns around the kind of rights of carers, that there's this sense that the kind of injustice of it continues, and this sort of speaks to kind of one of many issues around the kind of the sort of lack of care that is demonstrated in the state, particularly like the Magdalen laundries or with abortion rights, and then the direct provision centres as well. And there's this kind of care is just this, I think, like defining injustice. So I'd be curious to get your thoughts a bit on the commission and working with the groups, and what kind of the ambition with the work was. And then I've got a few more questions then about performance and cinema. Okay.
I suppose it was informed way back when I worked with young people in residential care. So that was one of my early thinkings about state care and the cared for, and what I didn't realise until I did the piece, the carers, and the relationship between those that are cared for and those that give care. And the reciprocity and the challenge, huge challenge. I made a very small work, but over a long period of time about that, and it really made me think. So in terms of the Yes But Do You Care, the genesis of that work was a totally separate work called Egress, which is a piece that was made, another filmic piece made with people living with dementia, and a musician, Kevin O'Shanahan, and that was looking at what might it be like in this twilight world of your ground shifting under you when you have dementia, this coming and going, and it was related to ambiguous loss theory. And at that time, I met a lot of carers who enabled me to work with the people they were caring for. And I instinctively felt I really, really want to work with this group of people, but knew that that wasn't the work. And then, long story short, doing a kind of residency at IMA, came across the new legislation and thought, this is actually the time to make a work about carers, because there's a lot of my work is very broad, and they're very wide strokes of thinking. And then there was a very crystalline moment of legislation changing, and I thought, okay, this would help me focus in on what's the potential for this. And it was being heralded, this is the Assisted Decision-Making Capacity Act, being heralded as this phenomenal new, I suppose, great achievement to have reached within the country of this new legislation, which indeed it is. It is. And I worked with people who were instrumental in implementing it from varying different perspectives. So, you know, lawyers and human rights people and all sorts of people. So I kind of really thought about it, but I thought the people that aren't actually being asked here and the people it's going to have massive impact on are the people that are caring for the very people that are being given more liberty. So for people that don't know, the Assisted Decision-Making Capacity Act seeks to give people that are living with, let's say, a shifting cognitive ability, more rights and control over their lives, very simplistically put in layman's terms from my point of view, and the right to make a bad decision. And I think in terms of what the work next door in the other gallery seeks to do after a couple of years working with people who are or have cared for somebody who is living with a dementia, and the implications of that, it's very hidden, the worlds of care that are very, very challenging when you love someone and you're doing your best for them, but in effect I feel a lot of carers' human rights have been totally brutalised themselves, but nobody knows that. So then what's the implication for the Capacity Act for them? Even though it's doing an amazing thing for the cared for, the very carers.
That kind of lack of support for people who are doing so much.
And even lack of knowledge of the reality of caring. And so the sensitivity of what you will tell people that you're going through. So one person spoke about a silent scream. That was his description of his reality in the world. And other people spoke about you cope because you have to cope. You do the best you can, which is exceptionally brilliant. But the wear and tear on yourself, that you then go to the bottom of the garden and scream and scream and scream. And you're not going to tell your friends and families because you don't want to burden them. So the challenge not only of what you're doing, but the impact on you, and not being able to share it or not being able to tell people. So that's what that work tries to unpack a little bit. It tries to show through Philip the dancer, Philip Connaughton, for him, asking him to embody the carer and the challenges of the carer being already at a point where they're, in my opinion, at breaking point, but coping phenomenally brilliantly with the new legislation, what it actually is going to do to them. And not being invited into the table of discussion on that. But for it not to be explicit and championed for carers, but more for it to be, let's think about this.
Because I think a kind of recurring theme through the talk and our conversation, I think, has been these different roles that artists kind of play, and there's different kind of ethics that you're navigating as you're playing that role. So kind of the artist is a storyteller, the artist is someone who's assembling stories and then creating installations in specific spaces, and you're kind of navigating a lot of that there. And one that really made me think about these different these kind of power relations, which become very pronounced when it becomes about legislation, was the shifting registers across the video. So you have moments where people are reading from the legislation. It's this more formal kind of official language. Then there's this vernacular, like people using Irish slang, and then there's of course the performer, right, which is through his body is showing kind of moments of kind of anxiety, but then kind of dance as well, and there's these hints of like kind of joy or kind of play kind of amid that all as well.
I think also the carnivalesque. So there's moments of utter madness. And the sense of with the soundtrack, that carnival, I suppose, merry-go-round, for whatever description of what people call it, and the fact that the legislative language is so impenetrable, and when listened to, in terms of the script that was written, that, like you say, includes the narrative of some of the act, how impenetrable it is, but how nonsensical it becomes. So it's not that it's impenetrable through understanding or naivety, it's more, in my opinion, the archaic nature of the way that it's contrived is a dance in itself. So it's exploring those three relations, exactly like you said.
I have I have some notes and questions and stuff, but I'm also aware I want to make maybe a little bit of space if Miguel has something to say, or if we have any questions from the group.
Yes, feel welcome.
I can join you there.
Yeah, if you want to.
Okay, sorry. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the engaging conversation and for your reflection that you shared with us early on. And maybe I could just throw you a question rather than Marie. We've been so much in touch and in conversation, and maybe then we can use that to open up a bit more. And of course, you are more than welcome to join us. So let me see if I can understand what you were trying to say. On one hand, so Chris mentioned a curator who was involved in this exhibition in Limerick called Eva International, a curator of African origin who currently works in South Africa, but she's not. She's from other country in Africa. And so she was articulating this idea that there is no discourse in Ireland of the fact that Ireland has been a colonized country, and apparently, from her perspective, being here, the idea of a post-colonial context was not present for her. And so, are you trying to say that a sort of critical engagement with pre-Christian culture, particularly folklore, within Irish art practice, is somehow a way of replacing or resisting, on one hand, replacing that lack of this engagement with a post-colonial discourse, but on the other hand, a resistance to a more corporate neoliberal agenda that the government has been instituting since, I guess, the independence, but mostly since the membership to EU in recent years? Is that what you're trying to articulate?
Yeah, I think, because I think that people are attracted to folklore for very different reasons, and there'll be overlaps why people are both returning to that history but kind of rewriting it as well. And definitely, I think post-colonialism is a kind of a huge concept here. Because I think that one sort of big aspect around a lot of post-colonial discourse, like that term I was citing, the cultural cringe, is that post-colonial states are often marked by this sense of inferiority. And there's this sense that even if you've secured independence, you may be still tied to the same economic systems that you were before, or you might refashion your institutions in the same shape as the previous kind of the previous power. So in returning to like a pre-Christian history, this is a moment before all of that took place. That it's before Christianity came to Ireland, it's before the British came to Ireland, and it's before Ireland kind of attempted to find its place in a kind of globalized economy. And I think that often artists like Marie, when they're returning to these things, are using it to prompt conversations around like democracy and place and identity. And I was also thinking that especially in the art world at the moment, there's a kind of a lot more attention given to a kind of post-colonial discourse at the moment. So I was kind of interested in maybe the tensions or the gaps between what's happening in Ireland and what's happening in this kind of global art world. And I think it kind of begins this really fascinating conversation about like power and place and what values are we following and where are they coming from?
Yeah, because I guess some of when Marie and I started working together was in the context of COVID-19, and I was involved in the development and presentation of a piece called Day of the Straws, which we present here in this exhibition as with a set of artifacts and an image and a video that was made to somehow tell the story behind that project. And I have the feeling that there was this idea of around the time of, or your concerns were around non-medical or outside of official discourse practices that people were using to address this plague. So thinking of cure in a different way from that which was being made public by the government or by medical authorities, and that somehow this was rooted in pre-Christian / Celtic / pagan. Maybe I'm using this terminology as synonyms, but maybe they are not. But bear with me, I'm not from Ireland, so my encountering with some of this terminology is from an outsider's perspective. But I think you were using that as your starting point or your interest. And I think that's also why I became interested in that work, maybe because I'm from elsewhere, where like there was this strong sense of roots into the past or into something that was maybe unique in a sense, and that was connected with a sense of identity or at least a sense of collectivity. And that somehow people were using it as a way of maybe creating alternatives way of engaging with that, which was that phenomenon that we were not aware of. But on the other hand, was a way I saw it as like a form of resistance, and a way of creating an alternative discourse or practice of resistance within a place where other practice of resistance, say UK, of people from former colonized areas or people from the global south have in terms of their own identity. Am I making sense?
And I think it was live, so it was in action. So it wasn't niche anymore. It was actually quite open and spoken about and being explored in a kind of, in my lifetime, a very unusual moment in time in terms of it felt generative. But exactly what you're saying, but not niche and not weird, but more, and not desperate either, which are the kind of, the whole thing about, the extremities. But it was more embedded and what about, which I thought was interesting. And then for the first time ever you could see the instant relations across the world in terms of people doing similar things. So it wasn't just niche and it wasn't just Irish. So I think,
because I think also, and I'd like to ask you this or have your opinion, so one of the reasons we thought of asking you to join us today was because you are working from London, and I have the feeling that on one hand, Marie's work is connected and very grounded in place and in narratives that somehow emerge from where she operates from and the history of the country in which we are, on one hand. But on the other hand, there are themes that are very broad and go beyond our context and have a sort of, particularly themes have to do with society, the way in which you live today, and the way we groups evolve and have a sense of commonality. And so, which are themes that maybe elsewhere other artists are also engaging with. And so, in your talk also there seems to be a point about Irish artists having to, on one hand, create some sort of language that is unique in the sense that they need to create their space within the global art world, but on the other hand, a desire to be part of that international dialogue, which they may not be or feel disconnected from, given the geographical position of the country or the story or the history of the country itself. So I'm curious about whether do you feel as someone operating from a center let's just use this terminology. And he also referred to concepts from the 1950s and the 1960s emerging from the global south or from parts of the globe that somehow represented the subaltern, and now the subaltern culture needs to create mechanisms to resist the dominant culture. So I'm curious to hear from you about how do you feel a practice like this one here, which we are showing in Cove, has resonance or not with other artists or practice that you are encountering, say, in London or in your own research elsewhere?
I think that's a huge question, so I'm going to try my best. I think there's a lot to it, right? So I think it's been pronounced more at different points in history, but there's often this pressure for people who aren't from major centres to kind of perform their identity in a way for people in those centres. And that becomes this really awkward fact and this really kind of precarious thing to kind of navigate, especially now. And I know a lot of people of colour and queer people who've kind of expressed a kind of similar feeling about that, like art worlds, and a certain sense of cynicism about the art world's kind of current interest in identity. I think particularly big in the institutions will have this pressure to kind of diversify their program, but they do it in this way that isn't really including those who they're kind of inviting to take place. So I think that's maybe one of the most pronounced or the kind of recent kind of examples of this debate, something that's kind of gone on for like a long time. But also as someone who's, writing about art and speaking with artists and stuff, it's very tough, because I think on some level you're always kind of negotiating some level of like social currency or kind of relevance and how you access these spaces. And I think it's useful to maybe think about why as well, right? Because at a practical level, especially if you're like an artist who's making their living from like the production and selling of art and stuff, you will naturally gravitate towards those centres because that's where a lot of resources are. But I think that there's a lot of activity that feels under pressure to orient itself that way or to perform that way, especially with like younger people when they're kind of fresh out of college and stuff. There's this sense that you kind of want validation or you want some acknowledgement from these spaces, and then you kind of overlook your own local scene or just other networks or like other kind of communities that you can be a part of. So I think it becomes this really complicated question about like attention and resources and who's being paid attention to and why. It kind of is a recurring debate whenever there's a big institutional show around like Black British art, for example, that certain histories are acknowledged and certain histories are not. And certain people get written into that story and certain people don't. So even when an institution is doing this kind of moment of like supposedly, kind of acknowledging a so-called marginalized community, it always kind of happens on their terms. So that's a bit of a convoluted question to say. I think that there is this very really tough pressure that people are under. And I think in an Irish context, then it kind of quickly becomes this conversation about people either staying in the country or leaving, or talking about like the Arts Council and how it's funding, or the kind of lack of a commercial market here, and all of that stuff. I think just becomes a kind of example of how the economic structures we find ourselves in kind of shape our lives, and I'll kind of end on this note. But I remember when I was in art school, one of my tutors said to me, "You just got to figure out the money stuff. Once you figure out the money stuff, the work will come." So I think that there's a historical level to the conversation. There's a kind of a critical debate, but then it does become this kind of very practical, everyday lived experience of just like trying to trying to make a living, trying to find a community to kind of engage your work, trying to, you know.
Yeah, because for me, for instance, I think also in terms of this exhibition here with Marie is our major project coming out of COVID-19, and somehow hopefully sets the tone to the ambition we have here. But I was definitely invested for different reasons in working with Marie, but one of them was in a sort of an aesthetics, a language, an art language, a practice that somehow, for me at least, has the feeling of connectivity with themes that audiences may engage with, and not necessarily a practice that is only following a trajectory within, say, art practice and art history, particularly the legacies of conceptualism, which for me are very dominant here in Ireland, but somehow, for me at least, function within an inner circle and in a sort of encased way, without really creating interaction with the societal matters that are urgent and relevant today.
And I think that becomes one of the really fascinating kind of lenses to study Irish art through, right? That there's these kind of these ideas that originate elsewhere that kind of do and don't gain a kind of currency here, and then there's people re-articulate it through an Irish context, and then that becomes a kind of fascinating kind of counter legacy to these larger narratives.
Yeah. Yes. So we should open up, Sarah.
I guess just about the mythology and kind of like I think what we said about like giving voices and like the body trades and like how it's relevant today is quite interesting. I guess that's like how we like kind of wrestle with that thing of like mythology being like a tool for like government or for creating like an Irish identity that's like exclusive. I just think that's like interesting. I was learning recently that like up until like just before the famine, like there was still like quite a lot of, even though there was like obviously Christianity here, there was still like a lot of like pagan beliefs like around like the land and that. It was only after that it kind of like subsided. So it's like not that long gone from like culture, and that it came back in like a more in a more like sinister way in like the Gaelic League, and that kind of like idea of making it more about people and less about the land, I think. So I think it's just I think it's interesting to use mythology as a way of, like you were saying, about like more about space and place rather than about stories that are connected to people. Or I think it's more useful in terms of just environmentalism and today to connect back to thinking about it as land rather than stories about people.
And what the land can do, so how people and land are interconnected.
Yeah, but Marie, maybe you could tell us a bit more about that connection that you wanted also to develop here a bit. Again, for instance, as an outsider in Ireland, the questions around lands seem to have been and still today very important in terms of how people here negotiate their identity, and then potentially even their post-colonial identity with respect to the divides in terms of ownership and use of land within the British times. So maybe that's something maybe because, for instance, in your work, people talk a lot about, or critical reception in your work tends to emphasize a lot the collaboration with people. But I have the feeling that, particularly in the commission work that we have here, questions around land are very important. Not just because you are using this agricultural architecture, physically and symbolically, to anchor your the themes that you wanted to explore, but also not only about that, but basically because of that, it has a strong history within the country. Maybe you want to say anything about that?
I'll say a little bit, because I'd love to hear what other people are saying too, but yeah, and to come back to you, and I suppose it's what comes to mind with what you just said is the rights of who has access to land, and especially significant sites. And I think it's really interesting that there's a lot of debate about whether if you have a significant site on your land, you declare it if it's not already declared, and what that then means in terms of registering it. So I think there's a lot there in terms of who has rights to sites and who can access sites, and what as a state we're doing about it or not. So that's a whole big thing that's in the mix of my thinking, but I don't really talk about a lot. I think the other thing is, what I think you make me think about is this sense of if you access a site, the potential for change within yourself, and I suppose this sense of I'll go back to the term I used with you, Chris, of the transformative, and it not being explicit or spoken about, but it happening. And it happened to a lot of people through the power of the land and what the land holds. And I suppose that was something that we haven't spoken about with the silo piece, the ritual stone water, is this sense of communication, and whether, which is what you're touching on in terms of our climate crisis, the sense of, and the charcoal, the land crying, the destruction of the land, and thus the destruction of ourselves, in effect. And if we think of the land as a portal to other knowing and other thinking and other ways of being in the world, and just think of it as a holy well being an example of one aspect of the land, so I'm not being so vague, and the destruction of that, or the dismission of that, what that means for us as a race and time. So I suppose all that's in the mix of my thinking, 100%. But as you say, I don't tend to talk about it very much. But I suppose more so in that piece, because I got to think about the narrative through the voice. I wanted to touch on it more explicitly. This sense of, is a communication coming as a warning, or is it a gentle aid? And it's back to this thing of, you were talking about, Chris, the duplicity of the protection, cure, the threat, risk. To always have that ever present in the work, which is where what you're alluding to we're totally at now, in terms of we're destroying the land like 100% over, and thus what else is lost.
And I think that kind of invocation of the of the climate crisis within this conversation is quite kind of telling, I think, about that kind of imaginative space that really kind of attracted me to the ways in which Irish artists are returning to these stories, right? And like you were saying about posing them as a question, that it's not simply that we are kind of repeating these stories exactly as they are. It's that they're always kind of being told and retold, and that's core to any understanding of like an oral storytelling tradition. And it's why we would tell them now, and why we would tell them again, and the quite compelling way that contemporary art can act as this kind of imaginative space to bring in those quite current and like pressing ideas is like really significant.
I suppose the work behind us that was in progress when we put the exhibition together, which is now complete, that goes on to, that's looking at electromagnetic energy in the land, and this sense of, is it friend or foe, and it being both, and the impact it has on the human psyche and the human body. So this very much thinking of the physicality of the land and the juxtaposition, I suppose, of what energy can do. So I suppose that's looking at now with our devices, as well as way back in terms of ley lines and the more archetypal thinking about dragon lines.
And it's quite useful to think about what role these stories play, which was as a parable, right? To like share kind of instruction and advice and meaning across generations, and at a practical level that was to keep people safe from the kind of dangers of the world but to also, share values through a community as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is there another thing that people, maybe it's a difference between a mythology and a folklore?
Yeah.
That people constantly do the things, but they don't really know why they're doing them.
Yeah, true.
And so, thanks everyone, beautiful talk. I have loads of threads that I'd love to pull, but there's no way I could. But I think, why is it at this moment in particular, I wonder there's a lot that the esoteric is having its moment in the art world. And why is the art world, kind of still so blindfolded in terms of not seeing itself as clearly embedded within the corporate and neoliberalism, and even the language that it uses, it can be so obfuscating. And so my question, I suppose, is why is the esoteric having its moment right now, do you think, all three of you? And what does it say about us in terms of, it says lots of things obviously, but and it's a huge question, but also the one about the language of the art world being, as sort of often as impenetrable as the language you spoke about, bureaucratic language. And also, artists nowadays are artists that are doing well in terms of socially engaged practice, they're very much so administrators. And I have so many, sorry, I'm really nervous. But I have so many great friends who are working within activism within the visual art world. But really, it's 80% of their time. They're administrators rather than artists. So you could talk about that a bit. That they're and administrator is a polite word in a way for a business person, frankly. So can you just talk about all these? I know it's big.
I think just to touch on it briefly, I think what's really fascinating to think about the history of neoliberalism and where it comes from is that it begins amongst a number of intellectuals and economists who are totally opposed to the kind of post-war consensus, where places like Britain build the NHS and America is talking about big investments in infrastructure and kind of social housing and stuff like that. And this begins as a project by a group of elites who feel totally marginalized, and they begin this decades-long campaign of trying to rewrite what economics is by developing whole new political languages around it, and then this kind of crystallizes in someone like Milton Friedman, who's a very convincing public speaker, but he's constantly delivering these thought-terminating cliches and these claims to a kind of common sense, right? That I would be bad economics, or that wouldn't make economic sense. These kinds of vague claims to a kind of common sense that is being kind of written and developed by the business community. And I think in the art world now, it's quite a pronounced fact that you have people returning to folklore or to other kinds of lost traditions and other kind of other alternative forms of knowledge and storytelling. And I think that plays a really powerful role, considering the way that it's central to neoliberalism to shut down people's thinking. So people are returning to these kind of lost ideas, these different ways of thinking, because if anything is going to change in a meaningful way, you need to be able to imagine it differently. So I just wanted to touch on that.
Do you think that interest to change as people return to these things?
Yeah. I think if we're thinking, well, it's tough. So I think in terms of if we're talking about economics and its relationship to the climate crisis, right? It's sort of very common to have politicians or business people warn that we need to be sensible, or doing something about climate change is too expensive, or this kind of stuff. And they can use very short phrases to kind of evoke to invoke a lot of assumed knowledge about what is sensible, what is a good way to spend spend money or to not. So I think it's not just about phrasing. It's about what we assume or what we know without knowing. But then I think that the language around folklore becomes really useful for that, because it's a different kind of script, and we can tell different stories with it.
Do you think that it's more understood?
I think it depends on who you're talking to. That there's some, there's some people, and I think you were saying this to me, Marie. There's some people who are kind of fully immersed in this stuff, and then there's some people who don't kind of know it at all, and that will say a lot about generation and geography. And then I know someone myself, and this is kind of my point of entry to it a bit as well, is that as someone who moved out of Ireland after I finished education and moved to London to find a job, you do begin to feel kind of quite disconnected from stuff in the past or stuff in your country, but then you kind of develop a new relationship with it, because you, when you're in a new context, you feel way more Irish in London than you would have back home, right? So and that's sort of why I began the text with that kind of talking about how my kind of early feelings or experiences about folklore were kind of uncertain or a bit kind of uncomfortable, because now I have a whole new relationship with it.
You're more objective.
Yeah, or I'm just way more interested in it now, and it seems super exciting. Yeah. But if you had asked me when I was 15, I would have been really embarrassed by it. Yeah.
Do you mind if I say?
No, I'll go after you.
You can do first.
Okay, so to answer one bit of your question in terms of why now, in terms of the esoteric, I suppose from my perspective, I think speculatively, it's almost like a battle cry in the sense of the unknown elements of the world that we're in, and it gives liberty because of that. It's almost like a kind of magical realism, the weight and the trudge against the what if. And I think the what if for creatives is really, 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 really important, and to hold that lightly and speculatively. Esoteric allows for that and encourages that. You're playing with that, and I think it's, for me, I think it's a sense of looking at what people are doing, and I'm almost running away from it because I think it's becoming so, and has been for a good while, so mainstream.
Yeah, it's like a trope. Ariana
Yeah,
is so
in itself.
amazing the way she talks about it. But yeah, it's very interesting.
No, not at all. But I think it's the potential it offers, and I suppose it's then the risk is it becomes exactly like you're saying. It weighs itself down. But go on.
Well, for me, I think that emphasis on the esoteric or on mythology, or in terms of medium, in terms of the renewed importance of crafts, that has to do with, on one hand, the sense of the relevance of that embodied knowledges, or knowledges that are not formed within the European or Western tradition have today. So the more and more we are, at least in academia and in creative practice, there is a recognition on one hand in the West of the dominant perspectives that have been emerging here and shaped our vision of the world. And by doing that, a critique of that, by enabling underrepresented cosmologies to emerge, whether they are pre-Christian, whether they are indigenous, whether they are feminists or others. So I think what it is against this Enlightenment-led kind of knowledge production is very important today, and we are really enabling that to emerge on one hand. So on the other hand, your other question around the arts and administration, it's Well, there are good questions there. One is the level of administration or administrative bureaucratic work that an artist is required to do today in order to either have a practice or even survive. That's one question. And the other question is the bringing together of that with the notion of the entrepreneur and of the business person. And how much is that left connected to a corporate world, right? So my answer to the first one is, it has to do with the way the art system operates in Ireland. So, because we were having a chat about that earlier, for me it's very heavily subsidized by the state, and with that comes a level of bureaucracy that enables the state to basically avoid having a taste or a politics that says this against that. On the other hand, because the level of the level of subsidiation, how do you say that? Like subsidies that exist here, and the emphasis is placed on the artist against the infrastructure. So organizations say Sirius Art Center operate with 90% reliance on public funding, but within it, it's quite underfunded. So we are quite under-resourced. Why? Because there is a trend of funding directly the artist, and because of that, the artist needs to operate as an administrator, play the role of the one who applies for funding, who writes reports, who has to imagine all of that, rather than focus on creative practice, when others will do that job, right? But because the emphasis is on the artist, and this has to do with a sort of, I guess, a romantic understanding of the figure of the artist as the quintessential predominant figure in the sector, that's why you have to turn into this, more than an artist, an administrator. The connection between that and the business person or the entrepreneur is quite an interesting point. I guess it has to do with the fact that more and more the understanding of art or creative practice without a certain impact or function within the social world, more and more is less obvious. So there's a sense of like, yes, so you are supported to produce something, but we need to understand the impact of that and so forth. And the same for arts organizations. So there's a sort of use value attached to the practice that somehow is maybe mirrors the idea of entrepreneurship, but also in the very strong individualism here, right? That's why for me also the infrastructure is quite underdeveloped, because the emphasis is on the individual, on the yes, so that's quite connected with the sector here and the way it operates.
There's a useful clarification to add, I think, from our conversation as well, was it's not that artists individually are overfunded, it's that the lack of funding in this infrastructure and this ecosystem, which would be essential to nurturing people's careers and developing work and developing their practice and mediating a relationship with the public. Yeah. That whole side is totally neglected to preserve this passive, individual, romantic notion of what the artist is. Like someone to be given a small pot of money and kind of left alone.
So to make it concrete, we are speaking in public. So this, to give an example, the artwork that is on display here in the center gallery, which is the new work, it is a commission by Sirius Art Center. So Sirius Art Center developed the narrative in dialogue with the artist, Marie, submitted the funding application towards it, which was successful, and then we received the funding from the Arts Council, which is the main funding body, so represents the government, in order to facilitate its development, production, presentation, and critical reception. The amount of funding that was made available is 20,000 euros. Marie on her own can apply for funding through another scheme called Project Award that may go up to 65 or 75, 3 times more or 2 times more what an organization can actually secure. But in that particular case, unless she is working in a close relationship and has a relationship of trust with an organization, the majority of the times she would put together a narrative on her own, write the application on her own, report on her own, put together the project on her own, hire people to deliver it with her, and so forth. So all that level of work that the organization has done for the commission has actually been transferred through that particular scheme to the artist. And that's why the artist spends the majority of the time doing that rather than making the work. But on the other hand, we organizations cannot support her more than what we can, because the framework of the scheme is itself preventing us from doing it. And what we are expected to do is only present, or at a minimum level, open the door, enable the artist to have access to our space, and then enable people to have a connection with it, but that's it. So in other countries, the system is maybe different, where the emphasis is on infrastructure. We are supposed to support artists to produce new work, enable that work to exist. Then that may be complemented with the commercial side of things, so the work may be sold, etc., which provides income to the artist and so on. But even when that's not the case, the majority of the bureaucracy around it lies within the institution. So the institution is stronger, but facilitates all this work so that the artist can focus more on their practice. So yeah, it's the way for me, having worked in different countries in Europe and the United States also. This is very unique to Ireland, and yes, and there are. I don't know if there are pros and cons, but it's a convoluted relationship we have with the sector in that sense.
Yeah, it'd be amazing if there was like curators who do like pro bono work and.
Oh, we actually do that a lot. I mean, I can't say now. I can't tell exactly how many, but since I came to Ireland, I have been helping. Helping is actually, you see, even the word helping is a complicated word. Supporting, providing support to many, many artists who are in need of developing their funding applications, because it's their main stream of income apart from teaching or casual jobs. And many. So some of them then are connected with the program we are developing, or my work as a curator, but the majority is actually not, or may not immediately, and that is an issue in that sense. So we do a lot of that work. That work is quite invisible, and in public forums or in private forums where I have been part discussing with the Arts Council and peers, we have emphasized, particularly I have emphasized a lot, the fact that we do so much invisible work that, one, either we stop doing because we can't, it's no longer viable, or we need to make that invisible work visible and public-facing, turn it into public-facing activity. But in order to do that, there is a level of resources that the organization, institution must have, which if we don't have in place, it's just creating more complications.
It's very similar to care work in that sense. The creative field, there's so much invisible work, that unpaid invisible work that goes on.
Exactly, and one of the questions we have, and actually this throughout COVID-19, this was really obvious, is that how undervalued by society and correspondingly underpaid is care work. Like, why do bankers get what they get when the person looking after someone when there are no nurses? That's quite obvious. There are no nurses, or they have to come from other countries. But why those during lockdowns that were stocking shelves in supermarkets are so underpaid and so precarious against someone working in, let's say again, in finance? Because care work is undervalued. It's the way, I don't know, I guess it has to do with, definitely has to do with the way capitalism works, but also represents a set of values in society that somehow, like say, artists like Marie or projects that you've been developed try to address and create alternative value systems. Yeah. So maybe, I don't know, let me see the time. Yeah, maybe we have another time for another question, or someone from the audience who has collaborated with Marie, for instance.
No questions. No. We've done all our questions over many sessions.
The commentary is, though, I'd say that, like, as carers, we want to be listened to, and we want people to hear us. this person here really listened and heard what we were saying, and we can't say the same about maybe politicians, the medical profession, or legislators. So we're hoping that this is a new form of communication for us, and that people will understand the emotions that we conveyed.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. But yeah?
Hi. It's hard sometimes to not with the question and you're listening to the whole question. So I suppose I've completely lost the question, but I'd love to hear more about the materials of Living Next Door, and to kind of bring it to that piece of work and the embodiment of the ideas, because it is, as we were walking around and I was hearing these ladies talk about the dust of the coal and the charcoal in the air, the smell, the embodiment of the work that as you walk on the quartz and the sight of it and the memories, it's immediately very individual. And I'm such a materials nerd that I just love the felt and the care with which the silo is made and the object. So it's not a question. It's just, could you tell us more about the material embodiment of how, maybe just how is it made and where's the wood from, and a little about that.
Sure. I suppose for me, it's the symbolism of each material. So it's that direct reference that you bring, so whether the quartz is a graveyard and are you allowed to walk on or not, and is it holy ground or is it not? And in practical terms, it might be interesting to share with the guys the tension of the gallery in terms of the materiality, because that's something that you wouldn't know. My vision for that work is that the charcoal's on all the floor, and that you walk and crunch the charcoal to get in, and then the trace of the charcoal traipses around. And that's practically, and in safety terms, difficult, because the charcoal goes through the floor, and then the alarm can't be put on and the insurance can't be covering the building. It's a precious ancient building. But I think the vision of this sense of you impact the work through the engagement with the work, and you leave your trace on the work and it changes, and then the surrounds of the work change as well. I think that's another layer, I suppose, that I'd be really interested to do with that work. And I suppose we'd like to have the haze constantly, but it's not practical too with the alarms going off. But so that you are immersed in this very much sense of not the everyday world of the air you breathe. I'm delighted that you felt that there was still, vapour from the charcoal in the air.
Is it actually still there? Because it looked like it was there. It kind of smell it coming off the ground.
So it is, and it's a matter of when the vapour comes out, the hope is that it then moves around and the charcoal particles still are present, so yeah.
Is it naturally coming out? There's nothing holding it around?
Yeah, no, I think the cleaners occasionally kind of move it around a little bit, but no, it's naturally coming out. But we didn't know if the smell would be present and the vapour. And I suppose I very much wanted that symbolic reference of a burnt forest, and the idea of it being a destroyed landscape, and then the pivot of that, because I always want the pivot of nothing's what you get, and what you see isn't what you get, nothing's so straightforward in life, is in fact charcoal's transformed. So it's a much more productive, effective source of fuel as it is, even though it's been burnt. So this transformative nature the material has gone through, that is like mischievously fun for me, in terms of you think it's one thing, it's actually not that at all. If you think about it more, or you research it more. And I suppose the space, the room I love making site-responsive work. So it was a big thing, wasn't it, which room was it? And then once we knew that, to think about the way you approach every bit as much as what you tread on and what you see and what you hear. So the view from the road is very important in terms of that bright orange paint. So I suppose every layer of the decisions are linked with how it makes you immersively feel, what you smell, what you hear, the resonance of that. Like you said, the crunching of the quartz is very important, and the sense of am I allowed or am I not? Am I welcome? Am I distressing something? Am I aiding it? Is all in the mix. And I suppose the tree stump, which Nick helped me get, this sense of, again, something destroyed or something beyond time and place of our understanding. So is it coming up through the ground? Is it still alive? Is it destroyed? To play with that in terms of it needed to be a tree stump, most definitely, and we kept the moss on, you know, as much as was possible, and oiling it continuously to try and keep this sense of it being still a living object. It's still active as an object, and I suppose that's the thing of the charcoal, it's still active. Does that go some way to
Yes, it does, and I'm really interested as well, this social practice and materiality, and this conversation around care and the role of the artist as story collector, storyteller, and even although the video here is playing the materiality of your work, with this one, that when you're telling people's stories, it's done with such care, that there's so many layers there, and that each thing represents. So when you're saying, well, why are people being welcomed into the work? And we quite often, so I'm studying social practice. I have a social practice. I'm doing the MA in research at the Crawford, so I'm in it at the moment, thinking about it. There's something about, we think of social practice as being administrative, out there, you know, things, and there is a lot of that invisible work, and then there's this piece. Is it a new form? Did I catch that correctly, that this is a new piece that was a new way of engaging with community of interest?
This is different in the sense of it's not specific to one person's lived story.
Okay, yeah.
And the trauma, which is concurrent all the way across my work, is collective and very broad and not spoken about yet. So it's new in that sense of most other works are an occurrence has happened, so someone's being trafficked and held captive, or someone's, you know, whatever the story is, it's past tense or still being dealt with, but it's holdable as one person's story or a group of people's, whereas a kind of, you know, a social trauma that's still unfolding in progress is a different stand for me to take, so it's far broader. So it's the same stuff, but a different agenda, I suppose, in terms of what it's trying to do.
It's really exciting.
Yeah. And for us here, it was also a way of connecting the work with the fabric of the building and the story of the building. So something that Marie didn't say, like as much as important is the view from the street into the silo, it's the view from within the silo to the water. Yeah, and so that window into, so you can't avoid the water in the location where we are, and the story of this building is totally connected with the water, with the arbor. So the water here functions as a kind of a landscape on one hand, but also as another material that is absent physically from the space, but is totally present symbolically. On one hand, or other ideas like, like the actual silo is a replica of a real one and was fabricated, made by a company who makes silos. And so it's the soundscape from within it is a mixed composition between two musicians. Both of them were in residency here, and they created some of the work there from their experience of being here. So that's really important. This is what it's not necessarily told, but it's what underlies like some of the thinking, and that's the interest in developing this kind of work, is how this building then resonates into the space. Even the small paint across the wall is a reference to a mural that exists behind it. And then, but what was really surprising was then, like things that we were not expecting. Like the smell was definitely something we were not expecting, and creates another layer, so brings real life into the gallery space. And for me, all this symbolism is quite important, and I think that's also an entry point into the work. And it's interesting what you're referring to, because people like us who write about art or have to work with artists, we tend to address subject matter and talk about the symbolism, etc. But the visual element of the display here, or the quality of the materials and what materials convey, is really important in that installation. And this is really crucial in that idea of translating a practice into a gallery context and how it exists on its own. So whoever comes through the door may not have any access to Marie's work in the past and needs to have an experience within the door, within the space, within the gallery, beyond any previous knowledge. And it has to be an experience that is both formative, informed, but also aesthetic in that sense. And I guess that's why also we were interested in working together. And to conclude, from my perspective, it's what Marie also mentioned about her vision, and between her vision and what is the actual manifestation of that, those negotiations that have to exist. It's exactly, that's what actually makes our work interesting, is like, what are the needs for us in terms of mediation, accessibility, how do we tell the story through our own perspective without colliding with the artist's vision, but how the artist's vision also needs to engage with the institutional framework. And going back to the conversation before about the arts administrator, that's what the majority of that's what maybe the funding system or the sector here does not understand, that artists no longer have never, in fact, but no longer particularly produced on their own. They have always been a part of a larger system, of social system. And without understanding that, there is no way that artists can thrive in dialogue with the infrastructure. Yeah? Final comment?
No, I think you ended beautifully there.
Okay, so thank you so much for joining us today. It has been a pleasure. And thank you, Marie. Thank you, Chris. And thank you all for being companions of this journey. We look forward to seeing you in the near future. Thank you.